So I'm kind of a little bit offended you would ask me about travelling as an older person because in my head I am still 24, 25, but I appreciate I'm not anymore.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure, a podcast looking at unfamiliar places across the world and aspects of travelling you may never have thought of. I'm your host, the Barefoot Backpacker, a middle-aged Denbigh with a passion for offbeat travel, history, culture, and the whys behind travel itself. So join with me as we venture beyond the brochure. Hello! My bestie came to visit me last week, and it was lovely to have her back around for a while. We went to a couple of pubs, we had long chats, and we even watched a couple of movies because she feels I need to fully appreciate the world of Disney. She didn't get a chance to go for many walks, though, because the weather was quite grey and autumnal. Remember, I live in the countryside, and walking around here is very nice. Thing is, she kind of had the choice between last week and this week, but it seemed easier for her to come up last week. So, guess what? I've barely seen a cloud in the sky this week, and while there's still a bit of a breeze, it's definitely been sunglasses weather rather than big coat weather. She is unimpressed. That doesn't mean, by the way, that I've started my regular running yet. I mean, I've done a couple this week, but I'm definitely not feeling fluid in my body quite yet. Maybe I never will again, and this is the first evidence that I'm getting old. It's the Calderdale Way Ultramarathon again on Saturday, but I'm not taking part this year. I did almost no running over the winter, and I know I could barely do a 5k over those bloody hills, let alone 50k. But the thought was there, briefly. I did indeed do my comedy routine at the sex therapy show last week. The event was quite experimental and involved an awful lot of icebreakers and some just scream out all of your anger mini sessions. But the comedy itself went relatively well. The audience was measurable in fingers and toes, and a quarter of that was there to support one act, Chloe Reynolds, who earlier this year won a big award at the Leicester Comedy Festival. So, we're not dealing with people who've only done one gig at an open mic event there. Anyway, my routine went okay, I think. It's hard to judge when there's so few people there. It felt fluent, but I still wasn't quite on my game as much as I should have been. What I didn't realise until afterwards, though, was that it was a paid gig. The organiser gave me a £5 for doing it, gave all of us a £5 for doing it. I mean, it's only a £5, and it's one half of the beer that I had in a bar and casual dining place over the street pretty much wiped it out, 'cause I'm a beer snob. But it counts, and I guess this means I can put professional comedian on my CV? Next stop, the Edinburgh Fringe? Maybe not. The only other thing I've been doing of note is writing blog posts. And by the time you listen to this pod, I should have about 5 new articles on the website. One about the border crossing between Guyana and Suriname, and 4-ish all about Svalbard, including what I did, what makes the place interesting, beer, and the ethics of travelling there at all. Bestie said the first half of my previous podcast episode sounded like it would be better as a blog post. Just to be clear, that's not why I wrote them, but it had always been my intention to do both the blog and the pod and reuse content from one feed to the other. It just so happened that the pod came first. I'm also posting regular to Instagram now. Again, all my current posts are all very Svalbardy. I only went 8 months ago. Quite on the ball for once. Maybe. Now, about this podcast episode. It was one of those ideas that suddenly came to me when I was lying in bed, having been seeded, I think, by a conversation I'd had previously with one of my travel content creator friends, Hayley. She's on Instagram as wild ever since, about how much it costs to live at home in the UK and how much less expensive it is to travel. I said I'd written a blog post about that very issue back in 2015, but that it probably needed updating, and anyway, it would make a better podcast episode. So here we are. Stick 2 other vaguely related topics with it, one of which I also wrote a blog post about in 2015, and Bob's your Nepo-Parent, as it were. Content warning. It, all turned out quite less cheerful than I was anticipating. And to forego any comments that may come up the back of it, no, I do not have a terminal illness. At least, I don't think I do. I'm just dour. So, there are a lot of posts and vlogs around, especially on Instagram, and presumably TikTok. I don't go to those strange places. Talking about how to save money to travel, showing you travel is cheaper than you think, and 10 ways of saving up for your gap year. This podcast episode is not one of them. There is also a lot of similar content about the costs while travelling and how you too can travel Thailand for less than $5 a day. Maldives doesn't have to be an expensive destination, or how I did Australia on a budget. This is not one of them either, although I've certainly been known to do that sort of thing in the past. Rather, what I'm doing here is a collection of thoughts looking at it from the other direction, essentially detailing the costs of staying at home and not travelling. But of course, I wouldn't be so corny as to use start case typography in the title of this section. I don't do clickbait. It feels slightly sleazy, like a dating profile. Those of you who know me will of course know that I own a house. Indeed, I was living in it when I started this very podcast series all those years ago. And for the purposes of the next few moments, let us assume that the last 8 years have not happened and that I'm still there, working for a large multinational corporate and spending my life trying to persuade call centre managers that yes, one longer call is better than an infinite number of shorter ones, and we just fixed people's problems first time like our corporate values suggested. They wouldn't have so many people shouting at them. When you live in a house you own and are responsible for, this causes several disadvantages when it comes to things like long-term travel, not least the simple inability to just pack up and go. Renting a house, or even still living with your family, makes travelling much easier since it's fairly simple to give a month's notice and do your preparations to leave in that month. And once you leave, you've got no bills or residual costs left at home. Whereas owning a home leads to a dilemma: sell up, rent it for a period, or leave it empty and just don't travel for too long. And when you have a full-time office job, as I did at the time I wrote my original blog post, I wasn't able to take more than 2 weeks off in one block. Where I work now are a bit more liberal with their absence policies, both intentionally and accidentally, but the latter's another story. So while short-term holidays were fine, for anything more substantial and life-enhancing, like the career break I did in 2014 and the travel I took after redundancy in 2018, this wouldn't suffice, and so I had to work out what to do with the house. Before I go into the finances of everything, though, I need to describe the house. As I'll talk about in a minute, its specifics are quite important for this analysis. It is a 3-bedroomed, semi-detached house at the edge of an old mining town. By semi-detached, I don't want you to think this is some modern large townhouse split in two. No, the only reason it's not a terraced house is because the whole terrace has defined alleyways between them, and therefore every house in the terrace is semi-detached. It's a very pedantic argument, but, It has a small gravelled and very weedy front yard and a larger, though still not in any way substantial, backyard on 2 levels, paved with large concrete slabs. At the back of the yard is a small stone shed. The whole house was built in the 1890s and looks like it. I bought it in 2006 for the grand sum of £78,950. Rightmove says it's currently worth £138,000, which is a bit like saying you can take the Eurostar from London to Paris for £35. It might be theoretically true given a specific subset of circumstances, but takes no account whatsoever of real-world conditions. And this is not just because it's been owned for 20 years by someone with ADHD and social anxiety who had a leaking toilet inlet pipe for over a year because they were too panicked to call a plumber. It is also because, you've heard me rant about Kirkby and Ashfield on many a pod, and some of it, let's be honest, is justified.
Most of it is justified.
But honestly, I recall a stat sometime in the late 2010s, which due to search engine fuzzy matching means it's really hard to find and confirm, it was in a newspaper, or possibly the BBC, which listed the number of £1 million houses by local authority. Ashfield Borough not only had no houses valued at above £1 million at the time, its most valuable house was guessed to be amongst the lowest in the country at just over £500,000. And even then, I have still no idea where it was. Even the village of Ravenshead, that I perceived to be the only possible contender, is in the neighbouring Gedling borough. Everything I say from now on must be listened to with that in mind. When I went away for my year-long career break, I rented it out to the brother of an ex-work colleague at a rate lower even than my mortgage payments, as they needed somewhere to live, as otherwise circumstance would have dictated he'd end up being technically homeless. And at the time I figured it was better to have someone in the house I could easily contact had there been any issues, and who was prepared to be flexible to my conveniences, so I could just stuff all of my belongings in the third bedroom rather than paying to keep it in storage. And having someone in it was better than having no one in it at all. At the time, I was also dating someone who lived in the same town, so as it turned out that I wasn't away constantly for the full year, I was at least able to have somewhere to go back to between trips. I did almost the same thing when I took redundancy, as it happens, renting the house at a rate lower than my mortgage, purely to ensure my house was occupied, this time to a friend. The ramifications of this are beyond the scope of this podcast episode, but if you know, you know. As it turned out, I stopped travelling off and on, and certainly had stopped after about 2 years, and then 2 months later we had a global pandemic, by which time I'd fled to Sheffield because I absolutely did not want to live with my lodger. But anyway, we're pretending that all didn't happen. So, let's get back to our assumptions. I am living in Kirkby-in-Ashfield, on my own, in a house I have a mortgage for, with a job that's above the national average wage. To be precise, 40 grand a year. The job one grade above me, that I took redundancy instead of taking because it involved people management, was paying at the time around 52. This was, at the time, above the threshold for the high rate of income tax in the UK. In fact, the role I'm in now is pretty much identical in that sense. It pays about 40k and the grade above me is, I think, 55. Lower in comparison if you adjust for 8 years of inflation, but that's what you get when you work in the civil service. Again, my wage is important to these calculations. The basic fixed costs of owning my home, that is to say, if I do nothing else, these are the absolute costs I would have had to have paid anyway. They are as follows. Mortgage payments, £450 a month. This used to be £350. I'm irked about this, not going to lie. Insurance, approximately £60 a month, which includes both home and buildings and contents. This is based on late 2010 bills, for reasons I really don't want to go into right now. Gas and electric, about £100 a month. I'd be a relatively low consumer, because I live alone, and I'm never there. Water rates, about £50 a month. The water bill comes in twice a year, and there's no water meter. And then council tax, £108 a month, with single occupier discount. This means in total, to maintain the house, regardless of anything else, I would have had to have spent a minimum of £768 a month. This works out at approximately £25.30 a day. Obviously, there's a whole host of other bills I'd need to pay, including things like internet, mobile phone, food, transportation, and everyday sundries. But my point is, I'd likely have to pay those anyway, regardless of where I am in the world. The only possible leeway is an internet access, which in many hotels and hostels is free, albeit not necessarily very good. But let's just have a think about this figure at the moment. This means that every day that I am alive, or at the time anyway, I would have been spending £25.30 just to maintain a brick building that I'm not even using when I'm on holiday. If that doesn't seem like a lot of money, let's just make some comparisons. If my average holiday is 2 weeks, that's around £350 on accommodation costs. For a 2-week rental stay in the Thai town of Chiang Mai, even restricting by private bathroom and bedroom, I have to go onto the second page of booking.com before I reach an equivalent cost. And I'm sure I could get that daily rate reduced even further if I stayed a month or two. Now, you might say, but Nell, you're just cherry-picking because Southeast Asia is traditionally affordable for Westerners, and you'd be right, but also doing the same search on Sucre in Bolivia brings up far fewer options overall, and yet maybe half of them are still below this value. Even Chisinau in Moldova works out often cheaper to rent an apartment than own a house in Kirkby-in-Ashfield, if we're looking at base costs alone. I also chose Chiang Mai precisely because it's a town that's noted, some might say notorious, for being somewhere where Western content creators and influencers are doing just that. And remember, I'm not even comparing apples with pears here. I'm comparing the fixed costs of owning a house in the UK, in a relatively cheap part of the UK too, with the costs of long-term rental abroad. Most people who own a house in the UK have a much larger mortgage payment because their house is actually worth, living in. Obviously, average mortgage payments are as useless as average energy bill comparisons because people and places are so varied in terms of house size and location. But a quick net search suggests the average mortgage is about £700 a month, and the average council tax bill is around £2,200 a year. I simply could never. Assuming even the same other costs, and assuming again you live alone so you get the discount, this leads to fixed costs of just under £1,050 a month, or a little under £35 a day. See how it's creeping up? But I don't live in that house anymore. It's beyond the scope of this podcast to talk about the implications of that too. But what I will say is that I now rent a 2-bedroom flat in West Yorkshire. So rather than having a mortgage of £450 a month, I have a rental expenditure of £1,200 a month. The monthly average for a 2-bed flat in England is around £1,430, so it's still cheaper, just not quite as ridiculously cheap. Given that the majority of people who would look to travel long term would be likely renting rather than homeowning, you're looking at a potential average monthly fixed payment of heading towards £1,600 a month or £50 a day. If you can get comfortable accommodation in somewhere like Chiang Mai for £25 a day, imagine what and where you could go for less than £50 a day. It would be cheaper for me to have sold my house and travel than it would have been to live at home, which is ridiculous. The other thing to bear in mind here, of course, is because in my job I earn more than the national average wage, I can afford to live in Kirkby and Ashfield. I could afford to live in a more substantial property. And so a lot of my money is, I'm just saving, there was a period of time when I was living in Kirkby and Ashfield where I was literally saving £1,000 a month because I literally could not spend it. And obviously a lot of people don't have that sort of privilege, don't have that sort of job. But it just goes to show you just how cheap Kirkby and Ashfield is and how, if Kirkby and Ashfield, if you can travel the world cheaper than living in somewhere like that, then imagine what the vast majority of people who are capable of selling up and moving on, just how much more financially better it would be for them. I find this frankly absurd. There are, of course, huge caveats to this around things like sustainability, long-term career aspirations, future-proofing, standard of living, and the sheer practicality and logistics of what might be termed digital nomading, and that's very definitely the subject of a future podcast episode. But doing a bit of financial analysis like this goes some way to show why people are interested in the lifestyle and seriously look into it in the first place. I am unable to with my current paid job because I'm not allowed to work outside the country. I'm not even allowed to take my work laptop out the country, and even the Channel Islands is pushing it. Due to the nature of the organisation that I work for, I would be seen as a potential target for scamming and hacking if I did. But if I took my skills and started charging travel bloggers and content creators for my knowledge and services, which is kind of more or less what I do in my day job, just not in that environment or industry, well, the world would be my lobster. One of the reasons I did not was because I was too worried about getting old, and that I would be better off having somewhere solid I could retire into without many overheads, because by then my mortgage would be paid off. Your mileage may vary on whether Kirkby and Ashfield is a better place to retire to than Chiang Mai. Or maybe it doesn't. It seems to be a given that the travelling community is made up of wide-eyed 20-somethings who want to travel the world, taking advice from low 30-somethings who used to be wide-eyed 20-somethings who achieved their dream. A combination of articles like 20 things to do in your 20s and 30 places to go before you're 30, coupled with branding and advertising that markets things like backpacker hostels, round-the-world tickets and the like to those people who are, to coin a phrase, young, free and single. Maybe there's a feeling that once you pass a certain age point, you're maybe assumed to be too old to be doing this sort of thing. Maybe older people are normally assumed to be career-focused, family-oriented, and don't have the time or the situation to go gallivanting around the world at the drop of a hat. There's also maybe an impression that older people are less fun to be around and less interested in travelling to new places, preferring instead to holiday every year in the same all-inclusive villa resort just outside Benidorm or something. Well, bollocks to that. As you know, last year I turned 50. I'm practically geriatric compared to these international bright young things. Parts of my website are older than the hosts of the Sounds Fake But OK podcast, who themselves have acknowledged they're quite elder statespeople in the asexual community. This fact alone slightly disturbs me, not because I have a problem with that, because I wonder if they do. Like when I walk into, say, a backpacker hostel and it's clear that I come across as the weird friend of their parents that never gets mentioned in family dinners. Indeed, some backpacker hostels have an upper age limit, usually 40 or 45, and to be honest, I don't really blame them. It is hard to slot seamlessly into that kind of hostel culture as an older person, although, if we're being honest, I never did even when I was young. I was already over 30 when I went to my first hostel after all. However, there are several advantages to travelling when you're older, even the backpacking style that I favour. 1. You can afford it. One of my friends has said that I should have more self-respect than to stay in backpack hostels anyway, and certainly to not take overnight Flixbuses from Glasgow to London for £11, because I can afford to do better, and why am I pushing myself through uncomfortable nights of little to no sleep or privacy just to save a few quid that I don't need to? She's got a point, and I do angst over money to an extent that's far beyond what is strictly necessary for someone like me. I don't have to do it because I can afford to do better. It's a choice that I make, maybe for the wrong reasons, but that's by the by. I've always felt, though, that travel can be as cheap or as expensive as you make it. There are many other travel bloggers out there who explain how you can go round Southeast Asia for less than $20 a day, or how to work while you're abroad, or how to take advantage of tricks and tips to get cheap deals and the like. All of this was good, and regardless of what your initial budget is, every single saving you can make means that you spend longer travelling. Regardless of whether you're 20 or 60, if you backpack, the chances are your overall spend will be quite similar. However, the advantage of being slightly older than the average backpacker means you're more likely to have a bigger budget to begin with. It's likely you'll have had a job for a while, that you'll have been able to save up a bit of cash to prepare for the trip, which means that when it comes to things like budgeting, you're more likely to be able to do more with it. For some people, this manifests in things like fancier hotels. And indeed, I know people, travel content creators even, who balk at staying in anything less than a 4-star hotel, or in upgraded travel, or expensive restaurants, or whatever. I mean, it's not my onions, it's not my curry. I just prefer to travel on a bit more of a budget. I've said before my idea of splurging is having a private bathroom. And regarding food, I know street food is cheap, but isn't that part of the reason you're there? To have, more local experiences? Rather, for me, an increase in budget tends to mean longer trips, because time and money are intrinsically linked. Also, trips to less easy places. Regardless of the costs of being in a particular destination, it's still more expensive for me to fly to Bolivia than it is to fly to Thailand. And taking more and longer excursions to get a better feel for the place while I'm there, and to see the lesser visited sites that I might also find interesting. And, of course, an ability to be more flexible in my travel plans. I can choose to take that more expensive but considerably more convenient flight, rather than be stuck with my original plans. Especially useful if and when things go wrong in my head, as they've been known to do. Sometimes you can't put a financial value on your own mental health. 2, you have more of an idea where to go and who you are. Suppose you're told from the beginning that you can take a year out of your life to travel the world, but you can only do it once and never travel again. Where would you go? And when? Many people do their travelling before their mid-20s, before they have a career or responsibilities, and their travel destination choices reflect their lifestyle at the time, hence the popularity of both existentialist soul-searching trips around India and party weeks on the beaches of Thailand and Bali. Much of the world is an unknown quantity, as, in the UK at least, the history and culture of much of it isn't taught in schools. The more you hear about the world, maybe from news programmes, documentaries, friends, work colleagues who've been to places you've never heard of, or are even from originally places that you've never heard of, or novels and films, the more something you'd never previously considered might interest you. When I was 20, I'd never really heard much about countries like Benin, and the idea of going to West Africa would have made me go, why would I want to do that? But over time I noticed more about them, read more about them, learned more about them, and realised that they had a lot to offer me. Sometimes time itself gives you the chance to find what it is that you're looking for. Someone tell Bono. As an aside, it's interesting to consider that many of the countries I visited did not even exist when I was 15 years old, and quite a few of those that did were also quite off limits at the time. I did a podcast about that very fact a couple of years ago. Also, of course, what you want out of a trip will change as you age. That doesn't necessarily mean a more stable, serious, sensible trip. For every party animal in their 20s who ends up as an accountant and discovers they really appreciate English country houses, there is someone who realises what they really want to do now they've hit 40 is to buy a rusting double-decker London bus, refurb it, and drive it to Australia just for the crack. Maybe it's a midlife crisis. Maybe they just did the maths and realised how much it was costing them to exist at home. Maybe it's Maybelline. People change and their wants and needs change with it. Our risk tolerance changes, but that doesn't mean we're less likely to take risks, just that we're a little more aware of them, and thus that our risk-taking is more intentional, and therefore perhaps somewhat more impressive. There is a trade-off between energy and experience, of course, and the younger you are, the more likely you are to be able to push yourself through those experiences and situations that older you would go, yeah, no, I ain't got the time for this shit. 20-something me would regularly pull all-nighters and still be as fresh as a barefoot daisy the next day. These days, if I'm not in bed by 2 a.m, I feel really lethargic the next day. But then being older means I've more experience of the effects, so I know what my body is actually capable of, as opposed to living purely off adrenaline and dedication. These days it's Elvance and bloody mindedness. 3. You're less likely to get homesick or have culture shock. No matter how old you are, if you go somewhere new, then there's a chance you'll stop in your tracks and be a little fazed by your surroundings. Things will surprise and confuse you, and it will take you a little while to collect your bearings. However, being older means that you just have that little bit more of that old cliched expression, life experience. No longer wide-eyed and acting like a rabbit in the headlights. You're more used to the way people are, the way you yourself come across, and are able, a little easier, to take it all in your stride, rather than being just that little bit panicky. The concept of self-confidence is bandied around. I'd say this is a slightly different concept, maybe self-comfortableness. Would that it were a word. In that not only do you have the self-confidence to go out and explore somewhere new, but also the self-knowledge that you know it's never going to be as strange as you might think at first. A sense that you've already seen what people are like in the real world, and in any case, know more about the world in general. So whether it be in Barnsley or Barbados, Detroit or Dili, it's not quite the unexpected chaos that you imagine. That said, I have never been to Cairo. 4. You'll be afforded a greater respect. Probably. It does, of course, depend on where you go and whether you've done the research beforehand. And while this, of course, depends very much on the individual, remember that stereotyping does exist. Many cultures afford respect to older people. This is particularly prevalent in Asia and Africa, and as a bonus extra, I'd suggest locals know that 30-somethings and beyond are less likely to climb mountains to post naked selfies of themselves on social media. I mean, we do, but it's far less common. Related to this, though, perhaps on the other side, is the feeling that the older you are, the less visible you seem to be. Younger travellers tend to get more of the attention, the people approaching to sell tours, the people standing outside bars enticing you in, the "do you want a taxi" type comments. I've been to some airports where I've basically been ignored while the taxi drivers jump on anyone else who comes out with a backpack. There is a thought here on the question of independence versus invisibility. I'd say my age means I'm more capable of travelling independently because I've had similar experiences in the past and know what to do, what to look for in most situations. But it comes alongside the feeling that I'm slightly forced to be anyway, and that I wonder if someone who's 40 but barely travelled would have a more difficult time in places like airports than someone who's new to travelling but is 20 years younger. Weirdly, I'll be doing a podcast on that very subject in a month or two's time. 5. You can still have fun. My earliest memory of older backpackers came on a group tour I did to China back in 2002. Most of us were early to mid-20-somethings from Europe and Oceania. However, also on the trip were a married couple from Sweden, early 50s. They were fitter than most of the youngsters, joined in all the banter, had far geekier technology. I'd imagine a few years later they would have been amongst the first to travel tweet and Instagram, and connected in general with the rest of us far better than you'd have imagined. They did tend to go to bed a little earlier than we did, but maybe they just knew that early starts were a ball ache. Or maybe they just had more knowledge of how they themselves would cope because they'd experienced it before and knew what their limits were. Maybe it proves that age is merely a number and that how old you are is merely a state of mind. Or that Swedes in general are young at heart. Although nothing beats the story I read in a magazine article in a doctor's waiting room in Australia in 2014 about the world's oldest backpacker. He was happily travelling the world, staying in hostels at the age of 95. He'd be 107 now, potentially. And that's the most unnerving thing about travelling as an older person. We have a sense of time, not in the no sense of harmony, no sense of timing way that I spoke about on my recent episode about travel through the senses, but rather a more existential one. which cuts deep into the need to feel I, particularly, need to travel despite being older. The knowledge that I don't have an infinite number of years to do this. While true, when you're 25, it's not something you ever really need to think about. 40 years until you think about retirement. That's 40 summer holidays, 40 backpacking trips, 40 different life experiences. That's plenty of time to see and do everything you want to do, right? And then before you know it, you're 50, your knees ache when you spend too long in an economy class flight seat, you can't party till 3 a.m. like you used to, and you've spent so many years on a decent quality mattress at home that the concrete runways they have in some backstreet B&Bs in Vietnam really don't cut the cheesecake anymore for you. And you realise that you still have all of these plans for places to visit, but every year that passes makes you consciously aware that time is indeed short, and there will be places you will never go. There will be things that you will never do, especially if you have a full-time job and a house. What's that phrase? Feel the fear and do it anyway? Although I think the double-decker bus is a bit too much. Someone did once ask if I'd ever thought of doing the van life thing. Listener, I laughed. You know the reason why. So, I've been travelling for quite a number of years now, as you know, and for almost as long, my friends have been telling me I should probably write a will. Not just because they think I have a tendency to travel somewhat precariously. Despite my mother's impressions, I have never been to an actual war zone because it's not 1983 anymore and a lot of places are much safer than she thinks they are. But, I will admit, I've certainly been adjacent to one or two. But in any case, some of them are genuinely surprised I have never yet been shot, arrested or deported, because I'm certainly capable of all three, by accident or design. But rather because they know that life happens, or rather stops happening, for any number of reasons. They don't want to have to handle the admin of sorting out the affairs of a procrastinatory chaos gremlin. You, listener, and they will be pleased to know that 12 years after it being put on my must-do list, I have an appointment with a solicitor on the 7th of May. I know you can do it yourself, or with a minimumist of effort, but I wanted to make sure that I did it properly and that I could ask questions just in case I wanted to do something in my will that was wacky and fancy in it. It's quite weird to think about in some ways. It's not like I have a lot to leave or bequeath. My only real asset is my house, and at some point I will get around to doing something with that, stop mithering me. But conversely, I don't have any dependents, so no one to leave stuff to by default. I'm going to have to assume that my mother and my uncle will die before I do. But honestly, part of me thinks that my mother is possibly immortal, or at least a demigod, in the mythologically flawed ancient Greek way, rather than anything to do with purity and honour, lest you be confused at my apparent sudden outpouring of parental love. What it's mainly got me thinking about, though, is responsibility, and how that shapes the way I travel. I mean, let's be honest, it shapes the way I live my everyday life, or would if I could spend my time worrying about it rather than the more holistic extinction level event that I'm 50 and I'll stop being able to live in quite the way I do in a smaller number of years than I really want to be reminded of. Making a will is me coming to terms with one of those responsibilities, that to people. Everything I do, everything I write, everything I podcast I can see in terms of my legacy, of me passing all my knowledge and experience onto other people as easily and as simply as possible. This has also meant other tasks, from small administrative ones like deduping my image collection, and no, very little of it is porn, all the way up to big tasks like sorting out my house and detailing my finances. Feeling a responsibility to other people, though, is much more than that. It's about communication and staying in touch, something I've always been notoriously bad at. It's also about doing the right thing for other people, regardless of the whys. Legacy isn't just about dependence. It's about your impact on the world, the footprint you make, how people think of you and what you did. It would be so easy to go, well, it doesn't matter, I'll be dead. But it would be nice to think I'd be remembered well, rather than go down in history as a footnote of someone who is known for other work. And anything I can do to make life easier after I've gone for those around me who I care for is something worth doing. Obviously, though, I also have a responsibility to myself. This whole podcast episode can be summed up as, I'm getting old, oh my God, and I've already spoken about that means I have somewhat less time to do the things I would like in the way I'd like than I'd like. But in order to ensure that, I have to have a responsibility to myself to ensure that I do it the best I can. Some of this is practical self-care. I do go to my dentist these days, more frequently than I ever felt comfortable with, and honestly, it's nowhere near as bad the second time. Because my fear had always been, I don't look after my teeth well, the dentist will shout at me and I'll feel both humiliated and resentful. But you know what? She didn't. And I don't. And the last time I went, the hygienist congratulated me on my teeth, which I think is kind of like, well, not winning life as such, but certainly scoring a well-taken free kick from midway inside the opposition half. I'm not as good with my overall physical health, and there's a small box from the NHS that I was sent on my birthday that's designed to test for bowel cancer, because I'm now at that age where they ask those sorts of questions. But the box is still unopened because, well, you can probably guess why. But some of the idea of being responsible for yourself, which links into being responsible for others, is self-awareness. It's being aware of your limits, of knowing that you can't stay awake till 4 a.m. partying every night. That you really shouldn't be out riding that motor scooter in Katuna without a helmet. That sometimes it's better to go home than burn out and or have some kind of mental crisis around social anxiety or financial angst that you really don't have any reason to. It's about making decisions even now that future Nell isn't going to regret, and of course the opposite. It's about making sure that future Nell isn't going to regret my not making decisions. And the latter is probably more pertinent given the passage of time. After all, I'd quite like to still be able to do some of this at 70, maybe not in exactly the same way, but surely as best as I can. I don't want to image myself stuck in some kind of care home suffering from a series of physical and mental ailments. I'd love to say I'm not aware of any familial history of problems, but then as far as I know, none of my grandparents made it even to 63, though at least in 3 of those cases it was their own fault, through either unhealthy habits or sheer bloody-mindedness. Well, that's one thing that seems to run in the family then. Meh. There is also a certain amount of responsibility for place. One of the things I noted in my recent podcast about Svalbard was how it was very much a place where people worked rather than lived, and that it absolutely wasn't a place to grow old, or really that much of a place to raise children, and therefore promoting ethical concepts as a legacy for your grandchildren didn't really land as a marketing strategy in the same way as it would in, say, the middle-class dormitory towns surrounding London. Similarly, I don't have children. I don't have a direct personal incentive to leave the world a better place than I found it. Not that that seems to be a thing even amongst those with families, but that doesn't mean I don't have a responsibility for future generations, even though they're not mine. Indeed, one might argue I have more of a responsibility, since it would be so easy to dismiss it. Obviously, responsibility of place means I need to balance my age and affordability with ethical considerations. Just because I can afford to, for example, fly rather than take the overnight Flixbus, or not worry about leaving lights on and things plugged in, or use an AI large language model to write a podcast episode so I don't have to, doesn't mean that I should, or at least not excessively. And honestly, the average AI tool would have an absolute fit at my comma usage anyway. Future Nell would like to live in a world that's comfortable, affordable and safe until she finally does die. And while there's not much I can do on a holistic level to resolve that, short of facilitating a series of revolutions, it's irresponsible to go, feck it, I'm going to die soon, and just do things for my convenience just because I feel I deserve it. And anyway, why wouldn't I want a better world for those that come after me? It feels weird and selfish not to. And surely, as a travel content creator, even one who goes beyond the brochure, or possibly especially for one who goes beyond the brochure, I want people to be able to follow in my footsteps and visit the places I've been and see the similarities, but also embrace the differences. They can only do that if those places still exist, like Maldives, like Kiribati, like ancient ruins in the Middle East. Overall, all these factors, money, age, death, responsibility, they all feed into and shape my travels. The trilemma of I want to do everything and go everywhere, I don't have time to do everything and go everywhere, and should I be doing everything and going everywhere anyway, especially at my age, is a concern I have that will only get bigger. Fear of missing out, and of, well, if you don't do it now, you'll never get to do it, for age, environmental or cultural reasons. Sometimes it almost seems that while travel feels like freedom, adulthood, especially as you age, becomes a responsibility that restricts that freedom through finances, through health, through circumstances, through even social pressures, and we have to find a way to resolve it that involves the least angst to the fewest people. That said, sometimes I think my retirement plan is the same as it would have been in 1983, experiencing the results of splitting atoms that don't want to be split in places that don't want atoms to split above them. Well, that's about all for this pod. Join me next time for another adventure beyond the brochure. Until then, remember, nothing is certain in this life except death, taxes and angst. And if you're feeling off colour, keep on getting better. Thank you for listening to this episode of Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, tell your friends that I rocked your socks. If you wear socks while listening to my pod, that's your call, not mine. And don't forget to leave a review on your podcast site of choice. You can tweet me at RTWBarefoot, and I'm the same name on YouTube, Blue Sky and Pinterest, or you can find me as Barefoot Backpacker on Instagram, Discord and Facebook. Don't forget to sign up for my newsletter, and if you really like what I do, you can slip me the cost of a beer through my Patreon in return for access to rare extra content. Travel Tales from Beyond the Brochure was written, presented, edited and produced by the Barefoot Backpacker. The theme music is Walking Barefoot on Grass Bonus by Kai Engel, which is available via the Free Music Archive and used under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. Show notes are available on my website, barefoot-backpacker.com. Until next time, have safe journeys. Bye for now.